June 6, 1944. The Cotentin Peninsula, Normandy, France. In a requisitioned chateau above the town of Saint-Lô, a 53-year-old German general limps to a map table on an artificial leg, and the invasion he has been predicting for months is no longer a theory. It is happening, right now, on the beaches below him. His name is Erich Marcks. He commands the German 84th Army Corps, LX-65 Army Corps, the formation responsible for defending the entire base of the Cotentin Peninsula, from Cherbourg in the north to Carentan in the south. Somewhere out there in the darkness, more than 156,000 Allied soldiers are converging on his sector by sea and by air. And of every senior German officer standing between them and the heart of France, Marcks is one of the very few who ever believed this exact place, this stretch of Norman coastline, would be the target. He will be right. Within 6 days, the fighting he predicted will be raging across his entire front. Within 6 more, he will be dead, killed not in the desperate defense he mounted, but in a strafing run on a country road, bleeding out in a ditch while his driver watches, helpless, unable to do a single thing to save him. He will never live to see the fall of Cherbourg, the collapse of the Cotentin, or the final verdict of history on the warning nobody in Berlin wanted to hear. To understand why his death matters, you have to understand who Erich Marcks was, and why a man with 1 leg, 2 dead sons, and a lifetime of loyal service to a regime he privately despised, ended up holding the most exposed piece of real estate on the entire Atlantic Wall. Marcks was born on June 6, 1891, in Schöneberg, near Berlin. He joined the German army in 1910, fought through the First World War, and by 1917 had earned a place in the elite Imperial German General Staff Corps, the intellectual engine room of the old Prussian military tradition. He was not a Nazi ideologue. He was a professional soldier of the old school, a man who studied philosophy before he studied artillery, and who carried that old-world sensibility with him into the most brutal war in human history. During the 1940 campaign in France, serving as Chief of Staff to the German 18th Army, Marcks altered his own army's advance to spare the historic bridges of Paris and the city of Bruges from destruction, judging that certain things mattered more than tactical convenience, even in wartime. It is a strange detail to know about a man who would spend the next 4 years fighting for the Third Reich, but it tells you something about who he was underneath the uniform. That same year, Marcks was pulled into something far darker, the earliest planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union. He authored one of the first operational drafts for what would become Operation Barbarossa, sketching the outline of a campaign that would eventually claim the lives of millions. War has a way of implicating even principled men in catastrophe, and Marcks would pay for his own role in it, with blood that was his family's, not just his own. In June 1941, commanding the 101st Light Infantry Division during the opening weeks of Barbarossa, Marcks was severely wounded in Ukraine. Surgeons amputated one of his legs. He fought the rest of the war on a prosthetic limb, walking with a cane, refusing to be sidelined. 2 of his 3 sons would later be killed on the Eastern Front, a grief that never appears in his official record, but that colleagues later said never left him. By 1944, Erich Marcks was a man who had already given the war almost everything a man can give it, and it was about to ask for the rest. After his recovery, Marcks commanded a series of formations in occupied France: the 337th Infantry Division in Paris, the 66th Corps at Clermont-Ferrand, and the 87th Corps in northern Brittany. In November 1943, as German High Command scrambled to reinforce the western defenses after Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt warned Hitler directly that the Atlantic Wall would not hold, Erwin Rommel arrived in France to inspect and strengthen the coastal defenses. It was into this reshuffled, anxious command structure that Marcks was given the LXS Corps, and with it, responsibility for the Cotentin Peninsula and the invasion beaches that would one day carry the codenames Utah and Omaha. The stakes riding on that single stretch of coastline were almost impossible to overstate. By the summer of 1944, the Soviet Union had been grinding the German army down on the Eastern Front for 3 brutal years, and Stalin had been demanding, since the Tehran Conference of November 1943, that his Western allies open a true second front in France to relieve the pressure. Everything the Allies had built toward for 2 years, the training camps in England, the artificial mulberry harbours under construction in secret, the thousands of landing craft, the deception operations spun out for months, was aimed at a single morning on a single stretch of French coastline. If the invasion failed here, there would be no second attempt for months, if there was ever another attempt at all. Marx's sector was not simply one piece of a larger front. In the first critical hours, it was arguably the single most important stretch of coastline in the entire war in the West, and he knew it. Here is what made Marx different from almost every other general in Rundstedt's command. He actually believed the invasion would come to Normandy. Most of the German high command obsessively fed a river of false intelligence through the Allied deception operation, known as Fortitude, remained convinced that the real invasion would fall on the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, the most obvious and most heavily fortified stretch of coast in occupied France. Rommel himself leaned that way. So did Hitler, for long stretches of the war. But Marx looked at the tides, the terrain, the ports, and the deception, and reached a different conclusion. Normandy offered the Allies something Calais did not: surprise. By early June 1944, that conviction had sharpened into something close to certainty. On June 2nd, 4 days before the landings, Marx reportedly told colleagues that if he understood the British at all, they would attend church one final Sunday and then come on Monday, June 5. After Tuesday, he noted, the tides would not favor another attempt until June 28th or 29th. He was wrong only about the day. Weather delayed Eisenhower's fleet by 24 hours. Everything else, the window, the urgency, the location, Marx had read correctly, while the rest of the German high command was reading tea leaves manufactured in London. And then, on the very morning that mattered most, the German command structure did something almost unbelievable. With the weather rough and the skies overcast, senior officers across the invasion sector concluded that no landing could possibly be attempted, and traveled to Rennes in Brittany for a map exercise, a war game rehearsing exactly the kind of Allied invasion that was, at that very hour, steaming across the Channel. Field Marshal Rommel left France entirely, returning to Germany to see his wife on her birthday, and press Hitler for more resources. General Wilhelm Falli, of the 91st Air Landing Division, and General Heinz Helmisch, of the 243rd Infantry Division, 2 of Marx's own subordinate commanders, were among the officers absent at Rennes. The one general in the entire sector who had guessed right about where the invasion was coming was about to be left holding the line with 2 of his key divisional commanders somewhere on the road, and no idea, yet, how close the hour truly was. The command structure Marx answered to was itself a tangle of divided authority. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt held the title of Commander-in-Chief West, but Rommel's Army Group B answered directly to Berlin for its armored reserves, meaning that the panzer divisions capable of crushing an Allied beachhead in its first hours could not move without Hitler's personal authorization. Hitler was asleep on the morning of June 6, and no one on his staff dared wake him. It was a system built for paralysis, and paralysis is exactly what it delivered. Beneath that fractured command sat men like Marx, expected to hold a coastline stretched impossibly thin, with troops who were, in many cases, not the hardened veterans of propaganda newsreels at all. Along his own sector, a significant number of the soldiers defending the Cotentin were foreign conscripts, Soviet prisoners of war, and Georgian volunteers pressed into German uniforms, alongside German troops whose average age hovered near 36, men judged too old or too unfit for the demanding fighting on the Eastern Front. Whatever else could be said about the German defense of Normandy, it was not being fought by Hitler's best, and hanging over every judgment call Marx would make that week was Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception campaign so effective that it had convinced most of the German high command that Normandy, whatever happened there, could only be a diversion, with the real invasion still to come at the Pas de Calais. Double agents, fabricated radio traffic, and an entire phantom army group under General George Patton, stationed in southeast England and visible to German reconnaissance, but composed largely of inflatable tanks and empty tents, had done their work almost too well. Even after Allied boots were on Norman sand, key German reserves would be held back for weeks, waiting for a second invasion that was never coming. Marcks was one of the only men in a position of real authority who refused to be fooled. It would not be enough to save his corps. So the question that opens this story is not whether Erich Marcks was right. History has already answered that. The question is what a single correct prediction is actually worth. When the machine around you refuses to believe it, when your own commanders are away at a war game on the night of the real war, and when being right does not save your corps, does not save your men, and will not, in the end, save you. At 0100 hours on June 6, 1944, reports begin reaching LXXIF Corps headquarters of Allied paratroopers landing across the Cotentin Peninsula. Marcks, at his headquarters in a requisitioned chateau north of Saint-Lô, does not yet know the scale of what is unfolding. Isolated reports, scattered gunfire, confused radio traffic from outposts near Sainte-Mère-Église and along the Vire estuary. It could be a raid. It could be a diversion, exactly the kind of feint the Germans have been warned to expect. It could be, at last, the invasion itself. Marcks has spent months insisting this coastline was vulnerable. Now he has to decide, in real time, with almost no reliable information, whether tonight is the night he has been right about all along. Two of his 3 divisional commanders are not there to help him decide. General Wilhelm Falley of the 91st Air Landing Division is somewhere on the road back from Rennes, racing through the dark toward his headquarters near Picauville. General Heinz Helmisch of the 243rd Infantry Division is in the same position. Only General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben of the 709th Infantry Division, holding the Cherbourg approaches, is in place and fully briefed. Marx's corps, on the single most consequential night of the war in the West, is functionally leaderless at the divisional level, precisely when leadership matters most. At around 0310 hours, still believing the airborne landings near Saint-Honorine and Montmartin-en-Grain represent the corps' most urgent threat, Marcks makes a decision that will haunt the rest of his day. He orders his 1 mobile reserve, Kampfgruppe Meyer, to march west toward Montmartin-de-Ville to counter what he believes are isolated pockets of American paratroopers. It is a defensible call in the moment, made with the information available. It will prove, within hours, to be exactly the wrong move, because the true weight of the Allied assault is about to fall not west, but along the coastline to the east. At a stretch of sand, the Americans are calling Omaha Beach. Before dawn, tragedy strikes his own command structure. General Falley, racing back to his headquarters through the darkened Norman countryside, drives his staff car directly into a group of American paratroopers near Picauville. In the firefight that follows, Falley is killed, becoming one of the first general officers of either side to die in the Normandy campaign. The 91st Division, already fighting blind, now has no commanding general at all. Marcks has lost a subordinate, before the sun has even risen, on the invasion he foresaw. At 0502 hours, German coastal watchers finally report unmistakable naval activity off what will become known as Omaha Beach. By 0520, visual contact is confirmed. The fleet is real. This is not a raid. 25 minutes later, the naval bombardment begins, an avalanche of shellfire from Allied battleships and cruisers that will not lift until 0625. German soldiers crouched in concrete strongpoints along the bluffs, men of the 352nd Infantry Division that Allied intelligence has entirely failed to detect, brace for what is coming. Marcks now understands, with total clarity, that his warning has come true. The relief of vindication lasts exactly as long as it takes for the next report to arrive. because vindication does not stop a single Allied soldier from landing. At 06:31, the first wave hits Omaha Beach, 1,450 men in 8 infantry companies, wading into a killing field of German machine gun and rifle fire from a division the Allies never even knew was there. For nearly 2 hours, the outcome hangs by a thread. American units are pinned against the sand, drowning in the surf, losing officers by the dozen. And for one grim stretch of the morning, General Omar Bradley himself will consider abandoning Omaha altogether. It is the closest the entire Normandy invasion comes to catastrophic failure, and the men Marks commands, dug into bunkers his corps built and manned, are the reason it comes that close. At 07:50, Marks finally realizes his mistake. He orders Kampfgruppe Meyer to reverse its march and race back east toward Omaha. But the reserve has already gone too far in the wrong direction. Had it stayed in position, it might have reached the beach by 09:30, early enough to reinforce a defense that is buckling but not yet broken. Instead, it will not arrive until the afternoon, hours after the decisive window has closed. One command decision, made in the fog of the first chaotic hour, will echo through the rest of the day. This is the burden of command in total darkness. Even a general who called the invasion correctly can still send his one reserve marching in exactly the wrong direction. By mid-morning, the German line at Omaha is beginning to crumble under the weight of naval gunfire, American tanks, and sheer persistence. Positions fall rapidly between 09:30 and 1000 hours. Believing the situation at Gold Beach, held by the neighboring corps, to be more critical, the local divisional commander shifts his own reserves away from Omaha entirely, sealing the fate of the German defense there. By nightfall on June 6th, more than 30,000 American troops have reached the shore. Marks's corps has fought as hard as any formation in the German army that day, inflicting more than 2,000 American casualties at Omaha alone. But the beachhead is lost, and it is not coming back. While Omaha bleeds, the northern half of Marks's sector, Utah Beach, is unfolding very differently, and the contrast tells its own story about the thin margins of that day. The American 4th Infantry Division, landing under General Raymond Barton with armor support from the 70th Tank Battalion, comes ashore roughly 2,000 yards south of its intended landing zone, a navigational error caused by strong currents and drifting smoke. It is, against every military expectation, a stroke of extraordinary luck. The stretch of sand they land on instead is more lightly defended than the beach they were supposed to hit. 28 of 32 specialized amphibious tanks reach the shore intact and breach the seawall almost immediately. By the time General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the first senior officer ashore and a cousin of the sitting American president, has personally adjusted the invasion plan to account for the mistake, resistance is already crumbling. Utah Beach is declared secure by midnight, at a cost of fewer than 200 American casualties, a fraction of the bloodletting 60 miles down the coast that same afternoon. 2 beaches, 1 corps commander, 2 entirely different fates, decided as much by tide and current as by any general's foresight. To the west, at Point du Hoc, a jagged limestone promontory bristling with what Allied intelligence believed were some of the most dangerous coastal guns on the entire invasion front. 3 companies of American Rangers under Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder scale sheer cliffs under fire, using rocket-propelled grappling hooks, reaching the top in minutes, only to find the casemates empty, the guns already withdrawn inland. It is a bitter, almost cruel discovery after such a costly climb. But the Rangers press on, discover the actual guns hidden in an orchard half a mile away, unguarded and fully stocked with ammunition aimed directly at Utah Beach, and destroy them with thermite grenades before a single round can be fired at the American troops landing below. It is one of the countless small, desperate improvisations that decide the fate of the entire invasion, unfolding entirely outside Marks's field of view, on ground his own corps was supposed to be defending. By the following morning, June 7th, the reality of the German position along the Cotentin coast has become inescapable. Marx's forces at Sainte-Mère-Église hold a stubborn pocket through most of the day, supported by German assault guns. But by nightfall, the town, the first French town liberated by American forces, is firmly in Allied hands, severing one more strand of the German communications network. General Karl Wilhelm von Schleben's 709th Division, still largely intact around Cherbourg, begins the long, grinding fight to slow an American advance it cannot stop, buying time with lives rather than ground it can hope to hold indefinitely. In the days that follow, Marx fights a corps commander's war across a widening, disintegrating front. On June 9th, American troops seize Sainte-Mère-Église, tightening the noose around the base of the Cotentin. On the 10th and 11th of June, brutal fighting rages along the Douve River as American airborne troops assault fortified farmhouses defended by German paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von der Heydte, in fighting so vicious that both sides pause, exhausted, to tend their wounded before resuming the slaughter. At one farmhouse near a blown bridge, American troops charge through a smokescreen with fixed bayonets, taking the position in brutal hand-to-hand combat that leaves the casualty count so heavy on both sides that a brief, unofficial truce settles over the field, while medics from both armies carry away the wounded. Marx's front is stretched thinner by the hour, his division's bleeding men he cannot replace, his supply lines under constant attack from Allied fighter bombers that own the sky above Normandy and make daylight movement a gamble with death. By June 11th, with his forces along the Douve buckling, and the town of Carentan itself, the vital road junction linking the American beachheads at Utah and Omaha, under direct threat of encirclement, von der Heydte makes the decision to withdraw his exhausted paratroopers rather than be cut off entirely, leaving only a thin rear guard behind. It is precisely this collapsing situation, the real prospect of losing Carentan, and with it any hope of reuniting his fractured corps into a single defensible line, that pulls Marx out of his headquarters and onto the road on the morning of June 12. He is not organizing a leisurely inspection. He is racing, on a wounded stump of a leg, in an open staff car, through skies owned entirely by enemy aircraft, to personally coordinate a counterattack that Rommel himself has ordered defended to the last man. It is, in every sense, exactly the kind of decision that had defined his entire career, showing up in person, at the point of greatest danger, because a corps commander who leads only from a map table cannot feel the battle the way his soldiers are feeling it. It is precisely that gamble that will kill him. On the morning of June 12, 1944, 6 days after the invasion he predicted, and a week that has aged him a decade, General Erich Marcks leaves his headquarters to organize a counterattack aimed at retaking the town of Carentan, a vital road junction the Germans desperately need to hold to keep their forces in the Cotentin from being cut off entirely from the rest of Normandy. He travels, as he has traveled every day of this campaign, in an open staff car, because a corps commander with a battle collapsing around him cannot lead from behind a desk. Near the village of Ebé-Crevant, a few kilometers northwest of Saint-Lô, on a road he has likely driven a dozen times in the preceding week, an Allied fighter bomber spots the vehicle from above and dives. There is no time to reach cover. A 20mm cannon shell tears into Marx's upper thigh and groin, severing the femoral artery on the leg he still has. His driver, uninjured, drags him from the wreckage of the car into a roadside ditch, and does everything a soldier without medical training can do for a man bleeding out from a wound that no amount of field first aid can close. It is not enough. It could never have been enough. At approximately 0945 hours, General Erich Marcks dies in that ditch, on a country road outside a village most people will never hear of, 6 days after watching his own warning about Normandy come true, and 1 week before he would have seen how the story ended. His body is recovered and buried, and the war does not pause for a single hour to mark his passing. That is the brutal arithmetic of total war. It does not matter how right you were. It only matters what happens next. And what happens next, for LXXA Corps, and for the German position in Normandy, is that things get very much worse. In the immediate aftermath of Marx's death, the fight for the Cotentin Peninsula, that he had commanded since its first hour, continues to unravel exactly as he had feared it might. On June 17th, American forces under General Omar Bradley reached the west coast of the peninsula at Barneville, slicing the Cotentin cleanly in two and severing Cherbourg from any hope of reinforcement or retreat. The great port city that Marx's corps had been built to protect, one of the deepest natural harbors on the French coast, is now an island, surrounded, isolated, and doomed. By June 18th, Cherbourg is fully cut off. German troops under von Schlieben dig into the hills and former rocket launching sites ringing the city, holding out through days of relentless bombardment. On June 22nd, more than 500 Allied fighters and bombers pound the German positions for nearly 2 hours in one of the heaviest tactical air assaults of the entire campaign, followed by American infantry pressing forward into defenses so deeply entrenched that the bombing seems, to the men advancing through it, to have accomplished almost nothing at all. Street by street, house by house, the fighting grinds into the city itself. American tank destroyers eventually firing point-blank into the bunker where von Schlieben commands his last defense before he finally surrenders. By June 29th, after brutal, grinding street fighting through the ruins of the port, the last German garrison surrenders, delivering more than 10,000 prisoners into Allied hands, and, just as significantly, a harbor so thoroughly sabotaged by its defenders that it will take Allied engineers weeks to make it useful at all. The counterattack Marx had died trying to organize goes forward anyway. 1 day later, on June 13th, under SS Gruppenführer Werner Ostendorf, 2 battalions of German Panzer Grenadiers, backed by dozens of assault guns, drive hard against the American paratroopers holding the southern approaches to Carentan, in a clash so fierce that American soldiers will remember it afterward simply as the Battle of Bloody Gulch. For a few hours that morning, the German attack gains real ground, pushing the American line back and threatening to retake the town Marx's forces had lost days earlier. But American armor arrives in the early afternoon. Tanks of the 2nd Armored Division rushed forward on Bradley's direct order after intercepted German radio traffic revealed the attack in advance, and the German assault stalls, then breaks, having lost 7 assault guns destroyed and 13 more damaged. It is the last real chance the German army has to reverse the situation in the Cotentin, and it fails within hours of the man who envisioned it bleeding to death on a road outside Saint-Lô. Command of LXXAV Corps passes to other men, but the pattern Marx had spent his final days fighting against, overwhelming Allied air power, a paralyzed high command, still half convinced the real invasion was still to come at Calais, and a defense stretched too thin across too much coastline, only accelerates after he is gone. The Normandy campaign grinds on for weeks through the hedgerows of the bocage country, a nightmarish landscape of sunken lanes and thick earthen walls that turns every field into its own private battle. It is not until the fall of Saint-Lô in mid-July and the eventual collapse of the German position at Falaise in August that the battle for Normandy is finally, decisively won by the Allies, at a cost, on the German side, that is almost impossible to fully calculate. Hundreds of thousands of casualties, the destruction of an entire army group, and the opening of the road to Paris and to the heart of the Reich itself. Erich Marcks did not live to see any of it. He did not see the fall of the city his corps had died defending. He did not see the encirclement at Falaise, or the liberation of Paris 74 days after he bled to death in a ditch outside Hebecrevon. He did not live long enough to be vindicated in any way that mattered to him personally, only to be proven correct in the cold, indifferent judgment of history, a judgment that arrived 12 days too late to do him, or the men he commanded, any good at all. Posthumously, on June 24, 1944, 12 days after his death, Marx was awarded the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors. a decoration presented to a man who could no longer wear it, for a defense he could no longer conduct, in a battle that was already being lost. He was laid to rest, and today lies still, in the German war cemetery at Marigny, sharing, as so many soldiers of that war do, a small patch of earth with thousands of others who never came home either. Historians who have studied the German defense of Normandy have been consistent in their assessment of Erich Marcks, a rare figure among Hitler's generals, a man who read the operational picture correctly when the machinery around him was captured by deception, wishful thinking, and the fatal rigidity of a high command, too paralyzed by conflicting orders and divided authority to react to the truth even when one of its own officers was shouting it at them. His prediction about the tides, about the timing, about the location of the invasion was not luck. It was the product of a disciplined military mind, willing to look past what Berlin wanted to believe and see what was actually there. And it changed nothing, because in a war machine as centralized and as politically distorted as Hitler's Wehrmacht had become by 1944, being right was never enough. You also needed to be listened to, and Erich Marcks, despite outranking the doubt around him, was not. He was not the only German officer to sound an alarm that Berlin refused to hear. Months earlier, in October 1943, Rundstedt himself had sent a special report directly to Hitler, warning that the Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete and propaganda, would not hold against a determined Allied assault, a warning significant enough that it helped prompt Rommel's own reassignment to France. But warnings about weakness in general are easy for a dictator to discount. What Marx offered was different and, in its own way, more dangerous to ignore. Not a vague appeal for more men and more guns, but a specific, testable claim about where and when the blow would fall. He staked his professional judgment on Normandy, on the first week of June, on a set of tides and a pattern of British behavior, and he turned out to be almost exactly right. That specificity is what makes his story land so differently than a general complaint about weakness ever could. It is one thing to say a wall might not hold. It is another to say, precisely, where the enemy will hit it, and to be proven correct within days. The wider consequences of what happened in Marx's sector that June rippled far beyond Normandy itself. The opening of a real second front in France forced Hitler to divert men, aircraft and armor away from the Eastern Front at the exact moment the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, the massive offensive that would tear the German Army Group Center apart and inflict losses even more catastrophic than the ones being suffered in France. Normandy did not just liberate Western Europe, it helped make possible the destruction of the German army in the East as well, a two-front vise that Germany had feared since before the war even began, closing at last, on the very coastline Erich Marcks had spent his final months trying, and failing, to convince his superiors was the place it would happen. There is something almost unbearably human in the final week of his life. A man who had already lost a leg and two sons to a war he helped plan the opening moves of, spending his last mornings on earth doing the one thing that mattered most to him, trying, with everything he had left, to hold a line he had warned everyone about for months, in a battle he had predicted almost to the day. He was not a hero in any simple sense. He served, faithfully and skillfully, a regime responsible for atrocities beyond counting, and no account of his tactical foresight should be mistaken for moral vindication. But as a case study in the particular tragedy of being right too early or listened to too late, his story has few equals in the history of the Second World War. More than 8 decades later, the road outside Ebec-Revon still runs quietly through the Norman countryside, past hedgerows that have long since grown back over the scars of 1944, and past a spot, unmarked to most who drive it, where a general who saw the future with unusual clarity ran out of time before the future could prove him right. War does not reward foresight. It only records it, in cemeteries and citations and after-action reports, for the historians who come looking, decades later, for the men who understood what was coming and could not stop it anyway.